Thank you and good morning. Let me start with just a couple of words about the Joyce Foundation. We are based in Chicago, and we are a grant-making organization funding projects to improve the quality of life in the Great Lakes region and across the country. Our work in the gun violence prevention program focuses on public policy reform. We believe that research and data are critical to informing policy and practice around gun violence prevention, and we've funded research and data collection projects for more than 20 years. I want to thank the Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council for this important convening and the members of the committee for their work. At the Joyce Foundation, our efforts and the efforts of our grantees are directed at several primary audiences: policymakers, law enforcement, and often the courts, which have been called on increasingly to evaluate existing firearm policies in Second Amendment challenges. Of course, we're also focused on educating the public about the issues we care about, but for purposes of this session, the research priorities I will discuss are based on ongoing feedback we receive about what kinds of research questions are of greatest interest to these primary audiences. Research for the sake of research may have its place, but our focus is on research that is actionable. To be sure, the presenters here today take different approaches to the issue of firearm-related violence. However, we can all agree that the toll of gun violence has a devastating impact on families and communities across the country and represents a public health and safety challenge of the highest order. As we all know, more than 30,000 people are killed by guns every year. Firearm deaths account for the majority of violent deaths in the United States, and firearms injure roughly 70,000 more people on an annual basis. Of the more than 30,000 gun deaths each year, more than 60% are suicides. Gun accidents account for several hundred deaths every year and several thousand injuries. Every year since 2001, there have been more than 11,000 homicides committed with firearms. International and interstate comparisons demonstrate that rates of homicide and suicide are closely associated with firearm availability. Where there are fewer guns, there are lower levels of homicide, suicide, and accidental shootings. Rates are higher where there are more guns. Homicide and suicide rates also vary by geography. Homicide rates in urban areas are higher than in rural areas, whereas rural areas suffer higher rates of suicide. There is substantial variation in state gun laws. Research finds a correlation between stronger gun laws and lower rates of gun death. There's also research showing the impact of specific state laws on criminal gun trafficking. These variations in state law provide natural experiments, and we should learn all we can about their impact. As requested, I will discuss three research priorities that we believe are most pressing, based on discussions with our grantees and the primary audiences we serve. These three topics are: first, research to understand the risks and benefits of guns in the home and policies and interventions that can reduce risk. Second, research to understand the risks and benefits of guns in public and policies and interventions to reduce risk. And third, research to understand criminal gun access and use and policies and interventions that can deter or prevent access and use by criminals. I'll start with weapons in the home. In 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects an individual right to keep a firearm in the home for self-defense. Existing evidence indicates that the presence of a firearm in the home increases the risk of homicide, suicide, and unintentional gun death in the home for members of the household. And the risk of homicide is particularly high for women. Prior research has demonstrated that having a gun in the home poses a significant risk of homicide for females in the home, and this is especially true for battered women. There's also clear evidence that gun availability is a risk factor for suicide. 9 out of 10 people who attempt suicide and survive will not go on to die by suicide at a later date. However, 85% of those who attempt suicide with a firearm will die in that attempt. Many suicides are impulsive acts prompted by a temporary crisis. Restricting access to firearms, even temporarily during a crisis, can reduce suicide attempts and completions. Guns in the home pose a particular risk to children and teenagers, with the majority of firearm suicide attempts and accidental shootings in these age groups occurring in the victim's home. When young people use guns to commit suicide, most often the guns belong to their parents or other close relatives. This research on the nature of the risk associated with guns in the home is vital and must continue. In addition, we need to understand how guns owned lawfully in the home are diverted to criminal use, and the role that the gun owner may play, even unwittingly, in that diversion. Particular areas of inquiry should be the role of private party transfers and storage practices that facilitate theft of firearms. We also need to better understand the potential benefits of guns in the home. Evidence of a deterrent effect of firearm ownership and data on defensive gun use have long been contentious. We know that justifiable homicides by citizens using a firearm are extremely rare. Future research on defensive gun use that does not result in homicide is called for. And more importantly, research is critical to better understand the ways to reduce the risk associated with guns in the home. Important research questions include, how can we better limit access to lethal means for individuals who may be undergoing a mental health crisis that could cause them to attempt to harm themselves or others? How can we promote safe storage practices in the home to reduce the risk of unauthorized access by members of the household and of theft? What are the most effective policies and practices to remove firearms from domestic abusers? What are the best practices for responsible disposal of firearms so that unwanted guns are not readily diverted to the illegal market? Finally, data from the General Social Survey indicates that rates of household gun ownership have been steadily declining over time. What impact do these trends have on rates of gun violence, on types of gun violence and victims and offenders, and on criminal gun access and use? The second topic I'll discuss relates to weapons in public. Public policies have become more permissive in terms of carrying weapons in public. Over the past 30 years, most states have relaxed their laws governing firearms in public places. A number of state laws governing public weapons carrying are now being challenged in the courts. Given what we know about the association between gun availability and gun death, research is needed to understand the impact of these changes in weapons laws. Similarly, so-called stand your ground laws have expanded the doctrine of self-defense to allow individuals to use lethal force in self-defense in public places without a duty to retreat. Since 2005, 26 states have expanded their self-defense laws to generally permit the use of deadly force in self-defense in public. Law enforcement groups have raised concerns about these laws, many of which were exemplified by last year's shooting of Trayvon Martin in Florida. We know little about the impact of these trends. Research should consider the benefits and risks associated with firearms in public places. Specifically, how prevalent are weapons in public places? To what extent are these weapons carried legally or illegally? What are the characteristics of individuals who choose to carry guns? What are the rates of violence committed by persons lawfully carrying guns in public places? How prevalent is self-defense use by lawful gun carriers in public? And what are the key characteristics of defensive gun use? What are the particularized risks associated with weapons in public? To the gun owner, to law enforcement officers, and to members of the community? Do these costs, benefits, and risks differ depending on population density? Many states require training for persons who wish to carry guns in public, but there are significant variations in requirements for gun training. What types of training and content are most effective at promoting safety? And finally, weapons used in crime. In addition to the more than 11,000 firearm homicides each year in the US, in 2011, there were more than 400,000 incidents of non-fatal firearm-related crime. In many urban areas, as much as 80% of homicides are committed with firearms. Criminal gun users get guns through a variety of sources, including from federally licensed firearms dealers, private sellers, theft, and straw purchasers. In some cases, because of gaps in existing law, criminals are able to purchase guns legally from private sellers who are not required to conduct background checks. In other cases, criminals may purchase guns legally from licensed dealers because their criminal history does not disqualify them under existing law. Other criminals obtain guns by theft, through illegal straw purchasers, or from licensed dealers who are complicit in the illegal transfer. Research is needed to understand the prevalence and characteristics of these sources. Additionally, we should all be able to agree that strategies focused on the supply of weapons to criminals have an important role in curbing gun crime and violence. However, there's a real lack of research on the most effective supply-side policies and interventions. Police and other criminal justice system actors play important roles in the prevention of gun violence, but without better data and research based on that data, they're challenged to do more to prevent gun crime and violence. Research can also shed light on the existence of any burdens on lawful gun owners associated with various approaches. Law enforcement groups in particular tell us that they need better information on the following questions. How do criminals obtain guns? How prevalent are the different sources of crime guns? What trends or patterns exist in the supply of crime guns? How do the sources of crime guns vary across cities and states? What accounts for those variations? How many would-be gun buyers who fail background checks go on to obtain guns from other sources, and what are those sources? How many and what are the characteristics of criminal gun users who obtain their weapons legally from licensed dealers because they do not fall into a prohibited category? Does this suggest the need for additional criteria for firearms prohibitions? How do differences in gun laws across jurisdictions impact sources of crime guns? Do patterns of youth gun access differ, and if so, how? What law enforcement strategies are in place in different jurisdictions? Which do law enforcement believe to be most effective, and what does the data suggest about effectiveness? What are the trends and patterns in use of weapons by type, and what are the trends involving high-capacity magazines? Do state variations in the data align with state regulation? How have these trends impacted law enforcement? Before I close, I will also go to a fourth additional point, which is around the need for better data. While public policy has to be informed by research and data, in the area of firearms, our public policy too often stands in the way of availability of data and corresponding opportunities for research, and I urge the committee to address these limitations, and I'll highlight just a few of them. First, limits on availability of gun enforcement data hamper efforts of law enforcement and policymakers to identify patterns and trends in criminal gun access and use. Beginning in 2003, congressional appropriations riders known as the TART amendments prevented law enforcement and researchers from having full access to crime gun trace data. Similarly, records of completed background checks by law must be destroyed within 24 hours. Since the inception, some of the restrictions have been relaxed, allowing law enforcement greater access to trace data and permitting ATF to release aggregate statistical reports. But raw trace data remains off limits to researchers. While the ATF has issued some statistical reports, they offer only basic state-level summaries that lack in-depth analysis. We regularly hear from researchers, policymakers, and law enforcement officials who are frustrated by the lack of current comprehensive data about sources of crime guns, criminal gun users, and relevant trends and patterns. We encourage the Department of Justice and the ATF to resume publication of comprehensive analyses of criminal gun trafficking, such as the reports produced as part of the Youth Crime Gun Interdiction Initiative and the Following the Gun Report. These valuable reports have not been produced since the early 2000s. And we urge that all of the TR restrictions be lifted so that researchers can resume identifying international and interstate gun trafficking patterns. There's also a need for systemic data about firearm incidents and injuries. The National Violent Death Reporting System, subject of a key recommendation in the 2005 NRC report, remains only partially funded for 18 states. Continued expansion of NVDRS would provide researchers and policymakers with systemic surveillance data about violent deaths, including gun deaths, in all 50 states. And with that, I thank the committee for its consideration.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Daniel Webster, who serves as the director of the Center for Gun Policy and Research at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And a quick reminder, the bios of our speakers have been handed to you or are in the front table.
Thank you, Steve.